Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really compelling family mystery. It almost has this true crime feel to it.
Definitely.
We're trying to understand a man named Charlie, but interestingly, we're going to do that mostly by looking at his wife, Henrietta, her experiences, the impact on her life.
Yeah.
That's our lens.
Right, because the information we have is so fragmented. It's a real challenge sorting out solid facts from, generations of family stories and whispers.
And for this deep dive, we're leaning heavily on transcripts from the Finding Grandpa Charlie podcast, specifically the first, 4 episodes?
That's right, episodes 1 through 4. They lay out the groundwork, mostly based on family memories and the host's own genealogical detective work.
So our mission today is really to piece together a clearer picture of Charlie, his life, his disappearance, by zeroing in on Henrietta's story as presented in that podcast.
Exactly. See what light her journey sheds on his.
Okay, so let's start at, the beginning for Henrietta in this story. Her arrival in Texas.
Right. The podcast suggests she likely came from Indian Territory. Possibly Chickasaw or Choctaw Nation origins are mentioned.
And the timing.
Around the fall of 1897, it seems.
Yeah.
Probably traveling down the Katy Line Railway, then switching to the Texas and Pacific.
Okay.
Ending up somewhere near Anson or Abilene.
And this wasn't just her moving house. There's a whole context here, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. This is tied into that bigger, often overlooked story of Native American displacement and migration. People moving into Texas, often drawn by the need for labor, especially for the cotton harvest.
So she wasn't alone in making a journey like that.
Not at all. Thousands of Native and mixed heritage families, also formerly enslaved people, were moving from Indian Territory around that time. It's a significant historical current.
It's really striking how little concrete information there is about her early life, though. The podcast is pretty clear on that. Official records. Scarce.
Yeah, very scarce. We're relying heavily on family lore here, like the story that she traveled with a stepbrother, but his name lost to time.
Yeah.
And that lack of records, it really highlights something important, doesn't it?
What was that?
Well, the experiences of Indigenous women like Henrietta during that era often just weren't documented in official ways. Their lives, their movements, largely invisible in the formal historical accounts.
So just understanding her arrival kind of points to this larger silence in history.
Precisely. It's a really significant piece of the puzzle, even this early on.
Okay, so Henrietta's in Texas, near Anson. How does she meet Charlie?
Well, the podcast suggests it was likely near Anson, which makes sense because that's where Charlie's father was leasing land at the time.
But how they actually connected, work, chance.
That's the thing, it's uncertain. Did they meet picking cotton? Did they bump into each other in town? We don't know for sure. It's another one of those details kind of lost to time, adding to the mystery.
But things moved relatively quickly after they met, it seems.
Yes. The timeline suggests Henrietta was pregnant by March 1898.
Okay.
And their son, John W. Henderson, was born in December of that year, 1898.
And significantly, the podcast points out there's no marriage certificate found for them.
Right, and that absence, it raises questions, doesn't it, about their relationship status, the social pressures maybe, especially in rural Texas back then. Living together, having a child without being formally married, that would likely have been noticed.
Which brings us to something really baffling. The 1900 census.
Ah, yes, the two Charlies.
Exactly. The podcast found 2 completely different census records for Charlie Henderson in 1900.
So in one, in Fannin County, he's listed with Henrietta and baby John.
Right, but then...
Then over in Stonewall County, he's listed with his father, and his status is marked as single.
How do you even square that? And Henrietta's listing in Fannin County is also interesting.
Very. She lists herself as white on that census. And she seems to have fudged her age a bit, made herself older.
Why would she do that?
Well, you have to think about the time. The podcast touches on this. It could reflect the intense societal pressures. Identifying as white, even on a form, might have been about avoiding prejudice, maybe accessing things, protecting her child. Frankly, it could have been about survival in a society that heavily marginalized Native people.
So, not just a simple lie, but a calculated move in a difficult situation.
Quite possibly. It tells you a lot about the pressures she was under.
And the podcast floats ideas for the 2 census records too, right? Maybe Charlie was trying to keep up appearances. One life here, another there.
Yeah, or maybe trying to manage things with his own family versus his life with Henrietta. It paints a picture of a really complex, maybe even precarious situation they were navigating.
And through all this, you start to get a sense of Henrietta's strength.
You really do, even with limited info. The podcast shares Granny's memory of her being big and looking just like an old Indian woman.
Yeah.
It suggests this undeniable presence, even if she sometimes had to downplay her heritage on paper.
There was also that note about the middle initial W in their son John's name.
Yes. The podcast speculates that the W might be significant, maybe a connection to Henrietta's own family name, something she wanted to carry forward, perhaps. A little clue hidden in plain sight.
When official records fail you, those small details become huge.
They really do. And her choices on that census, identifying as white, changing her age, they speak volumes about the tough decisions people on the margins had to make, the strategies they used just to get by and protect their families.
Okay, so after the 1900 census confusion, where do they go?
Sometime between 1900 and 1905, they move. East Texas this time, Houston County, near a town called Ratcliffe.
Ratcliffe. What was that like?
According to the podcast, it was a real boom town. A lumber town, think axes, steam engines, kind of a Wild West vibe, but with sawmills instead of saloons, maybe? Or maybe both?
Part of the big East Texas lumber boom?
Exactly. Charlie fits right in, working in the sawmills. The records show him as a laborer, sometimes renting. It was tough, dangerous work, but it was work. Provided a living, even if it wasn't always stable.
And something significant happens in Ratcliffe, recorded officially.
Yes. A really poignant discovery. A birth certificate for a baby girl, just listed as Baby Henderson.
When was this?
August 1912. In Ratcliffe, the parents listed are Henrietta Waters and Charlie Henderson.
Waters. Her maiden name.
Seems likely, yes. The podcast notes that's significant, and Charlie's name might be misspelled on the certificate, apparently.
But what happened to the baby?
That's the heartbreaking part. There are no further records. Nothing. And Granny's memory, shared in the podcast, was that the baby died very young.
Oh, that's awful.
It really is. It adds another layer of hardship to Henrietta's life. And the podcast suggests this period, around 1912, was critical. The birth and death of this baby. And potentially, Charlie's departure seemed to coincide.
Which lines up with the family story about how Charlie disappeared, doesn't it?
Roughly, yes. The story passed down was that he died around 1912 in a railroad accident. Granny said he fell under a train.
A specific tragic end.
But as the podcast emphasizes, there's no death certificate, no burial record, nothing official to back up that story.
And that lack of proof is key to this whole family mystery aspect.
Absolutely. It opens the door to the possibility that the story isn't accurate. Maybe it was a cover story, or maybe it was just wrong, especially given what the podcast uncovers later. 1912 seems like the moment Henrietta was truly left on her own.
So Charlie's gone, one way or another. What happens to Henrietta?
Well, she doesn't stay alone, at least not on paper, for too long. By the time the 1920 census rolls around, she's remarried.
To whom?
A man named Mercer. His first name is another detail lost to time, unfortunately. They'd moved by then over to Polk County.
And the family situation.
The 1920 census shows a blended family. Henrietta, Mr. Mercer, and all the children, including John W., are listed with the Mercer surname.
So a new chapter.
Yes, and the podcast mentions she had another child with Mr. Mercer, a half-brother to John W. It shows her building a new life, providing stability after Charlie's absence. A testament to her resilience, really.
But did she talk about it? About Charlie? Or even Mr. Mercer?
Apparently not. The podcast really stresses her silence on the subject. Granny remembered her as strong, resilient, carrying her past quietly, dignified.
So she carried these major life events, Charlie's disappearance, her remarriage, without discussing them much, if at all.
It seems so. That silence is powerful, isn't it? It hints at maybe deep pain, or perhaps just a decision to focus on the present and future to protect her children.
How did her life end?
Henrietta passed away from cancer in 1938. She's buried in Peebles Cemetery over in Polk County. There's a headstone, but it offers very little about the life she lived. Her silence kind of speaks volumes, doesn't it? About what she might have endured, the choices she made, that strength Granny remembered. Maybe it came from navigating all those unspoken things.
Okay, so that seems like the end of Henrietta's story, tragically marked by Charlie's absence. But then, the podcast drops a bombshell.
Right. This is where the investigation takes a huge turn. They find another Charlie Henderson in the 1920 census.
Not presumed dead in 1912, Charlie.
Nope. This Charlie Henderson is alive and well in 1920, living way out in Potter County, Texas, Panhandle region, hundreds of miles away.
And he's not alone.
Not at all. He's listed with a new wife, Marie Josephine, and they have 2 children already. A third child comes along later.
Wow. So the railroad accident story.
Looks very likely to be untrue. This strongly suggests Charlie didn't die back in 1912. He just left. Left Henrietta and John W. and started a whole new life.
What happened with the second family?
Well, the podcast digs into that too. By the 1930 census, Charlie and Marie Josephine are divorced.
Okay.
Charlie's living as a boarder by then, working in the oil fields, interestingly, with his son from that second marriage, Mike.
And the other children.
There's a detail about the middle child from that second family seemingly being missing from later records. Another gap, another potential disruption.
And Marie Josephine.
She passed away in 1938, the very same year Henrietta died.
That's quite a coincidence.
It is. These details, the divorce, the missing child, they paint a picture of maybe a pattern. Instability, perhaps. Broken connections. More questions, really.
And then there's one final twist. Years later.
Yes, the lawyer. This is astonishing. Decades after Charlie supposedly died, sometime in the late 1950s or early 1960s, a lawyer apparently shows up.
Looking for what?
Looking for Charlie Henderson's heirs, claiming that Charlie had only recently died.
Recently, as in the 50s or 60s.
Exactly. If that lawyer's information was correct, Charlie lived potentially decades longer than anyone in Henrietta's family thought.
That completely rewrites the timeline again. It just deepens the whole mystery around him. His disappearance, his life, his actual death.
He really does. What was he doing all those years?
The podcast host mentions having to make a judgment call, right? Connecting the early bachelor Charlie from the census anomaly with the later gambler Charlie of family stories, even without DNA proof back in 2001.
Yeah, and that highlights a common challenge in this kind of research, especially when you're dealing with patchy records and family memories that might be, well, colored by time or emotion. You often have to weigh the evidence you do have and make an informed leap. Absolute proof can be elusive.
So wrapping up this part of the story, focusing on Charlie through Henrietta's lens really brings her strength into sharp focus, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Her resilience is undeniable, facing his disappearance, raising John, remarrying, building a new life, all while carrying the weight of whatever happened with Charlie.
But the unanswered questions are just immense.
They really are. And Henrietta's silence about Charlie, and even about Mr. Mercer, it hangs heavy in the air. It speaks volumes, perhaps about trauma, perhaps about protection, perhaps just a quiet determination to move forward.
It leaves us with a lot to think about, and maybe a final thought for you, the listener.
What does Henrietta's story, and especially her silence, tell us about the lives of people on the margins, particularly Indigenous women, in the South at that time?
And how does her hidden history shape the mystery of Charlie himself? What does it all suggest about the complex ways family stories are built, the truths they hold, and the truths they might conceal? It makes you consider the weight of those unspoken histories in all our families.